I feel that a lot of adult anxiety is being projected onto kids. And that, as the result, is actually producing these children that lack the resilience. And therefore, they, as you say, then don't develop the skills to sit with difficult, complex emotions. And that is the bigger issue. And I think that's the discussion that we need to be having. And I looked into the whole etiology of anxiety as a disorder. And really, it comes as a big shock to people to learn that prior to 1980, anxiety was not a disorder as such. It entered the DSM, which is the main diagnostic tool used in the US, but also in Australia and the UK, until 1980. And it happened to be, 6 months after the first anti-anxiety drug was invented. So prior to that, does that mean we weren't anxious? Of course we were. But we were anxious, and it was one response to amongst a whole range of other kinds of responses that we would have. And anxiety was deemed often appropriate. I mean, of course, there were anxious disorders, so obsessive compulsive disorder, anorexia. There was also bipolar or manic depression, as it was called back then. These diseases did exist, and interestingly, they always exist. And I found this correlation in my research when I was researching the book, in about 1.2% of every population around the world, which suggests that it's an evolutionary quirk that exists for a really important reason. And I'm sort of going off on a bit of a tangent here, but I think it's an interesting one, and it feeds into this idea that anxiety hasn't always been a disorder. Anxiety was seen as something that we had to live with, and in fact, for many people, or I should say for that 1.2% of the population of people, it was hard, they had it tough, but there was a sense that it was that it had always been that way. And so Diane Fossey, who did lots of work on chimps, she found that when she was looking at a clan of chimps, there was always about 1.2% of the population that had these traits that emulated obsessive compulsive disorder. So highly agitated, couldn't sleep at night, on, super sensitive to smells and sounds. And she would remove these particular chimps, these neurotic chimps, from the clan, and the clan would disintegrate within about 3 months. It couldn't survive. So these sensitive chimps that existed in 1.2% of the population, they would hear the danger, the tiger that would, creep up at them at night. They'd be able to smell when a food was poisonous. They fretted about the welfare of the group. And without them, a society can't function. So a big part of my premise to my book was that, and the title of the book suggests as such, first we make the beast beautiful. When we can see that these particular traits exist for a reason, we can then have a very different discussion around it. And as it turns out, 70% of poets, 70% of scientists, and the majority of wartime leaders are bipolar. Or throughout history have been bipolar. Huge number of artists, same thing. There's an association between these conditions and incredible sort of productivity and creativity and contribution to the human experience, which is a long way of saying that, when we don't deem these conditions a problem, when we can sit with the discomfort of some really incredibly hard experiences like anxiety and depression, we have a very, very different experience.
Yeah, it does seem like we have not only discredited the value of anxiety, because that's what I hear you saying in some ways, and maybe, correct me if I'm misreading what you're saying, but there's an inherent sort of value in anxiousness that can be evolutionarily useful in some capacity, and that part of it is maybe us learning to see the value in it. It's like anger. A lot of the men that I've worked with over the years have tried to live in such a way as to avoid their anger almost entirely, because they've been told that if they're angry, they're toxic, they're unhealthy, that anger itself is a useless emotion. And so a lot of men will come into our work either, completely unhinged in their anger because no one's ever taught them how to deal with it, or they've just never gone near it because it's been this, is perceived as a toxic chemical that, they should never handle and that they should try and rid themselves of immediately. And it seems like socially we've done that with anxiety, that we've kind of ostracized it and said, this is a terrible thing. You shouldn't feel it. If you're feeling it, immediately take some medication.
Take medication.
And take medication. Tell me, so just to make sure I got that right, anxiety as a disorder didn't enter into the DSM-5 or DSM, because it wasn't a DSM-5 then, until 6 months after anti-anxiety medication was produced. Did I get that right?
Correct. And it was 1980. So in relatively recent history. Do you have any other insight into the role that pharmaceutical companies have played in quote unquote mental health and treatment? Because that seems a little suspicious for sure. Like, immediately I'm like, well, that's a little too convenient, that all of a sudden, we have anti-anxiety drugs and we produce the cure to the problem that hasn't really necessarily existed before, right? It's like that seems a little strange. And so, yeah, can you say more about that? Yeah, I mean, I don't go into it too deeply in terms of other disorders because I focused on anxiety. And I should actually just mention to listeners, I have OCD. I've lived with obsessive compulsive disorder since I was 11. And I also have bipolar. I was diagnosed when I was 21. So I come from a position of absolute curiosity and doing the sort of the experiment on myself. And as anyone with one of these disorders knows, just taking a pill for the rest of your life just never seems to sit really comfortably. For me, I always had this burning sense that there was purpose to everything that I was going through, which is not to say I haven't needed medication during periods in my life. And I say this very, very, very clearly in my book. Medication is a salve, particularly when you first get diagnosed. And before you've developed skills to self-modulate and manage things. So I just want to put that out there in case people are wondering, where I sit on the medication front. But look, medicine first sort of history of various ailments, particularly in the mental health realm, is very, very common. There are a number of disorders, and I don't have, all the details in front of me, so I don't want to give out information that I can't back with you right now. But it is a very, very common story. And look, I don't get too worked up about conspiracies and big pharma and all of this kind of thing. I'm more interested in moving the discussion into, okay, well, how can we then take agency in a productive way? And even to the extent of using your anxiety as a superpower, which is essentially, that book took me 7 years of research. It was an epic book to research. And because I to write a book that basically claims to go beyond the medical model and work, certainly hand in hand with the medical model, but it expands our thinking. I needed to get my information right. And I should also say that I give the book to 3 American mental health sort of professionals and institutes, and 4 in Australia and 2 in the UK, and got them to fact check absolutely everything and make sure it's responsible and safe information that I was sharing. But yes, I think I would advise people listening to this to take note, to not get overly upset about it, and instead put the energy into working out how you can sit with your anxiety in a far more fruitful way. I like to say that I don't just live with anxiety, I thrive with it. And I've learned to do that predominantly through reading spiritual texts, psychological texts. I think you'd be aware of the work of James Hollis. He's an incredible Jungian therapist. He very much inspired me and gave me incredible intimate advice. His Holiness the Dalai Lama. I was an ambassador to His Holiness for 3 years, and he worked with me a lot on some of these theories. So yes, I prefer to go on a different kind of journey rather than getting angry. And I went through all this work, Connor, when I wrote my I Quit Sugar books. It was exactly the same story. You have these big, big companies taking a vested interest in setting us up with a problem and then coming in with the fix. And, it's the same story that gets rolled out over and over again. We needn't be surprised anymore, and we are better off channeling our energy into doing things differently.